There we go. So I'll give a quick overview anyways. I was just talking in class with giving some overview of Git stuff or basics of Git. And we haven't talked about Git in this class as much as we have in some of the other classes. So one thing that I definitely am looking for from the students is any feedback on topics that you really want to cover or want to go over in more detail, whether it's some of the development environment stuff around React, some of the React topics we've covered or anything like that, to make sure that we go over those and you guys are feeling comfortable with what we've talked about so far, because we've covered sort of the core elements of working with React. And then going forward, probably after this class, which is more using some of these same skills that we've already developed, then we'll start branching out into some of the areas around just the core of React, which includes some of the more advanced ways to put stuff together and work with elements, some of the more advanced state management stuff, just sort of touching on some of these other topics so that you're familiar with what exists in this ecosystem, because there's a lot more than just the core of React. So that'll probably be sort of a potpourri type, maybe one or two topics each time, playing around with some of these. And not going into as much depth as we've gone into the core of React, because the more that you understand the base of it, the easier it is to get these other concepts and elements. But if you have any topics, anything, whether it's Git, whether it's, I really want to talk about an IDE like KSU use Visual Studio Code, let's talk about using that, or let's talk about your development environment, or even what does it look like, the life cycle of building out something with React, or more on styling, whatever is interesting to you, let me know, and we'll try and make sure we touch on those topics going forward. So we were just going over, this is and I'll switch over to show you all the commands again to get up to this state if you're not already here. But this is the latest state of the stopwatch that I've got uploaded. I know different people have been doing different styles. This is just using this Material UI library that we were talking about in the last class. And it's nothing too fancy compared to what we had before, just a few simple things, using some of their typography components to make some of this stuff look a little nicer, some of their button components, paper to give it sort of a border and stuff, but nothing outrageous. But also there's a lot of stuff like sort of this hover behavior and this ripple effect when you click that are sort of complex to accomplish if you are trying to build this out yourself and get all that styling. So that's, again, just showing off some of the benefits that we've got from leveraging an existing library. So if you're trying to get up to speed with that and you haven't already, you already have a Git. Maybe you have or haven't connected to my repository, then you could, this first command is optional. Most of you shouldn't need to do this if you already have this repository in your remotes. But once you've done that, then you might want to do a git pull master. However, if you have changes sitting locally that you want to make sure you get committed, that you don't want to lose, then it would be a good idea to create a separate branch and then come back. So this will be the set of instructions to sort of accomplish all of that. So you might do something like a git checkout -b my version, which means you're going to create a new branch called my version and check it out. That's doing two things at once. Think of -b as saying create this branch, and then checkout means switch to that branch. Then you would do like a git add dot, which should add any files that you've changed into your staged point, and then you can commit that. You probably want to give it a message, You can be whatever you want. And now you've got your stuff saved up in this my version branch. So once you've done that, you shouldn't have any problems. And then you could always check out master again and pull it. So let me show you that in a little bit larger. That's what that looks like. Simple set of steps if you haven't already done that. And that would let you be based off the same version of stuff that we have right now. And then to make sure that you have all of the code right, we've got our commands that we've previously run. Once you've pulled that, which would be npm install, and then npm start, right, is going to start your app. Same type of stuff that we've been doing. But that, yeah, the goal of that's just talking about getting you back to the same starting point that we're at right here. If you want to work off of your own starting point or where you are in your app, you've got your own styling, then feel free. I figure today, a couple things. So last class, I challenged people to work on the idea of adding in a lap timer. I don't know if anybody's worked on that, but my thought is we'll do sort of like what we've done before in class, where we'll split up the work between hands-on coding examples and just talking about what it would mean to add something, because it's important when you're doing development to not just be diving into your code before you think about it, right? Plus, it gives you an opportunity, if you're not at the same point in time, you haven't quite reached this point in your project, you can still participate in the conversation about how would we add this functionality. So I think what we're gonna do is split up again, first split up into the groups, and we'll try and limit that to maybe 10 or 15 minutes, where we'll talk about how would we add a lap timer based functionality, what would that look like, what do we need to do to accomplish that, and then come back and try and add a basic version of it into this stopwatch so that we've got some sort of lap timer going on. And then after that, I think it would be really useful to start talking about how you interact with other sources of data other than what you're putting in, right? So we'll have a very, very simple example of talking to a third-party source to get some data from it and bring it into your application. So that's nothing, it's not gonna be anything really complicated at first. This is about the most basic example, but we'll go hit up a service that, this is really what we're gonna hit up right here. That'll give us time. Very simple. It just gives us back some data in a format that we can use. So we'll just say, hey, I want to hit this, get some data, and then render that as a clock, because we've already got all the clock capabilities sort of built in here. And that'll get a very basic introduction to hitting third-party sources. Next class, I plan on starting to talk about, and this will probably take the whole class, spend the first part just doing concepts, is this concept of how to work with higher order components. So this is something that can be very confusing when you first encounter them. Fundamental part of React, they're not like built into the environment, they're just something that comes about as a way to build out functionality using React's sort of model and the way that it works. So yeah, the first things first, let's talk about a lap timer. So the concept of a lap timer, and we can, I'll sketch something out really fast, or maybe I can find one online. Stopwatch with lap. This looks nice and easy. So this is what like a lap timer looks like with a stopwatch. Basically what it does is it captures how long it's been since the last time you hit the lap timer on that stopwatch, right? So it says like, oh, okay, that, imagine that you're running around a track, and every time you make a lap around the track, you hit this button so that you know how long each lap took you, right? That's where that idea comes from. So that's the functionality that we want to try and add into our application, is something that looks very, very similar to this. We're gonna want to be able to accomplish these different fundamental aspects of a lap timer, where you click the button, it records how long it's been since the last time, and you're able to click it multiple times and just sort of add to a list of laps that you've accomplished. Are there any questions about that functionality-wise or from a conceptually? Make sense? All right. Then you can work on your own if you want, but I encourage people to split into groups again. What I'd say is, let's go till 7:10 or so. And then just talk about how you would try and build something like this out. So don't start getting into the code yet. Think about what would you have? Like, what components do you need? What components do we already have that you can reuse potentially? And how you would accomplish this goal. What are the tricky parts? Maybe you might take a little bit of time saying, what do you think are going to be the gotchas or the hard parts that are going to be hard to capture? And then we'll come back at 7:10, talk about what people have, and then depending on how we feel, we might build something out here together, or we may decide, okay, well, let's have the build out be a challenge that we go home and work on ourselves, and then I can provide an example of it again later. We'll figure out where we go from there. All right. Have at it. What does? Oh, when you click reset? Yeah. I would say don't worry about that. We probably won't leave that defined. Like, that could or could not do that. Maybe there's a second button that says clear lapse instead, right? I don't think there's a set way to do that.
I was curious if they
looks like it clears it when you click reset, but they also have some different behavior around, like, you mean that guy? That guy right there? Hearing easy listening music? Wait a minute.
I just realized how loud that person was playing hard for us. It's actually pretty good acoustic stuff. They have good acoustic the other American Underground.
It's probably why he takes that spot.
Yeah, I think it's the building. What's happening?
You have a question? What's that? You think you're good? All right.
The thing is that I think had you do this, I actually did do any work. I did add a repository. I did. It's in my repository. But I named my repository something else. I didn't name it. You can switch his name.
I tried to do that and something and
I know you're building, but you could, if to start out with, you could just switch the name of his. And it's like get remote rename, and then you just put the old name. Something else.
I have all the yeah, and on my file, like I said, it says if you want to say it, I'm just changes.
Yeah, at least you get it right. I don't know why.
I think there's something we should have done.
Well, I know I did, I remember having a little problem with the fact that lessons had an excellent different. So I think I did something, so
I think I left.
I looked up how to push the tag.
I used classic game.
Usually it's
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of stuff. And when I get it, it was from C9, it was like, no, you need a key, because, like, when it doesn't recognize that it's right, like, colleague, or it's a person instead of a corporation. I have to write that, and, yeah, and it was all uploaded from C9. I don't have any problem with this on my computer. It like recognizes like a different thing. It is.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, up and running.
Sorry, I forgot.
It's like that, you need like that. That's so
Okay, you have to
actually
have
authorize
the
it.
right.
So, you know.
Still not close. But anyway,
Well, we're doing.
So we have this information, and I'm sure that you need to save the stores and they
So-
every time for everybody.
Well, we already have the data, right? When we pause, we're keeping, we have the
yeah, it's still
current time or something.
It's in the previous last time.
Yeah. So we're gonna have a way to display it, and I was thinking in a way to initiate listing.
But-
We need three things.
That's the commission changes once you.
Well, we probably just save it to something.
Yeah, we need to. And ranks.
Yeah, add it to
So
it.
that data every time they have previous last time. Rank.
We can map it and then, each thing you would be.
yeah.
Yeah. The time display thing.
That array would just go through as props to the
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Every time,
Yeah, there might be
like a stage
like
change.
a dynamics array, and then it's array using something that does how it's going. Component that just handles.
I was wondering
Yeah,
what
so that's
this.
the array map, the LI,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So it's, I mean, somewhere. Where? Right.
We need to store current collapse.
Maybe so. Remember, don't we have files?
No, the way we collapse. Based on the current time, before we start.
Talk about calculating.
I think it, remember correctly, when we pause it, we'll restart it, it takes collapse time. Adds that to it. Collapse time. Before it is on pause, the collapse time.
Yeah, that's the data.
But it would need to be, I guess it would be. We have a.
Need to write the button. And this data is going to be shown. Can we use the time display?
Yeah.
We're gonna use
Do you really want to do this for the kids, right? Or at least mine's having split,
Oh, yeah.
Right.
You know, we could do
I do wanna see
the
that-
display size as like props. And then just use the sign. Promote it again and just tell us what size we want, so it's not like the big
Right.
top size.
Yeah, we definitely want, I think we do want that, all of that formatting.
Yeah, so why do you think?
Yeah.
Have to change some size.
Yeah.
In this case, this person used the same style for a certain time. That is the orange one. That's the one.
We have that split time. That's, so that what that does is when you hit lab, the split time up there goes back to zero.
To zero,
You
yeah.
glance at it.
Yeah.
You're-
I don't think. Maybe.
Should we? Well, I guess you have the trigger button and the button thinking the turtle last time had to.
You know what?
Right.
Number one, number two,
This one is that lost it.
on the left.
When we were discussing whether we wanted to have like.
Yeah, I think there's gonna be bullet
displays,
points where you can make that an ordered list.
Yeah.
And it would just do
There.
it automatically.
Yeah, so whenever you hit split again, it puts the time down there, but it also clears, sets that.
It's like if you're running a map, like you do your total time
Yeah.
and then each time around the track.
So we're just gonna recycle the, we're gonna recycle the time. Time display. For the-
We might want some kind of on off switch for the lab area. So that way.
I'm gonna give you guys another 5 minutes.
Basically,
Doing a lot of good still.
like before you hit the lab button at all, then that whole area should not be there, right? And then as soon as you hit the lab button once, then it like turns on and keeps adding to it. And then when you hit clear, it would go back to like off, off state. Doesn't that make sense? You don't want to empty, you don't want to like a bullet list that started with just empty
No.
stuff.
Like what if you, like keep.
Mhm.
Saying that if I click on that last button, I'm separate from
No, what I was thinking was,
Because we already have it clear, but.
yeah, the clear clears out the
So
lab.
maybe
Add some
clear,
buttons.
it gets rid of all the left.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's already what
Exactly.
it does.
Yes.
It's like
Yeah, yeah.
6 to 0.
Yeah, I'm just talking
I
about.
don't clear to clear. That's really helpful me. I don't
Clear to clear.
It's clear.
No, I guess I'm just talking about the use, like the case of before someone hits the lab button. Make sure I display,
Yeah, not to show.
there's no lab area.
Well, it
But that could just be display lab equals true or false.
I mean, unless you, remove the bar thing, it wouldn't show the.
Yeah, just a
It wouldn't show the bullet point. If it's an empty drive.
Yeah, that's right, right? Yeah,
By default.
okay.
I don't know why I said
I'm
that.
comfortable with that. Yeah, it's fine.
I think.
Yeah, this is the name.
Sounds true.
You have. You're not gonna have any LI.
Got this files. So the next one is NPM. Start.
Historical laws and use.
I think it's just.
So
That's good shape, get free.
Do you want the text on the side? That seems so.
On the reverse.
So here you can hit, yeah.
So is this last one, is it supposed to be? I'm confused, why?
It might be an
Pause
old version,
anyway.
but it's still.
It's not running. So that would still be the lap? Is that how laps work? Do you usually pause? I thought you just like, the lap is just dead when you stop. Like, that's it.
That's
Like,
the way.
there's no taking a break, finishing your lap. Next to the last time, and I was like, well, what is the point of this saying, like, pause, are you supposed to restart that lap?
I mean, you don't have to have that exact thing. I think the only reason it's saying that is because it's telling you this was paused. This isn't a result of a split being clicked. It's just telling you what was triggered.
It seems very useful, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's useful.
Yeah, it's not like required. I mean,
Okay. I don't know if it's extra functionality.
There-
as much as it's kind of-
there is a case where you would pause. I mean, obviously it screws stuff up, but you know, if somebody's being a casual runner, like they're running in their neighborhood, they have to cross the street and they can't, so they stop and they want to pause and finish later and then say it was part of their split. Now, obviously that's cheating a little bit because, you know, they're just standing around, but
Yeah.
that's a case where like something like that could happen. But
Well, I started. So I don't know, I don't want to. Like, right? That's not. I'm not sure. I just downloaded.
That's just the reality.
Yeah.
Although it does have nice spread. I have that with this with iPod. And then I can't find stuff because I have.
whoa, it's like old school college
I have,
green notebook thing.
this is the real one, right there.
Okay. That's okay.
Yeah,
That's the class, it should be black and white. I'm a little.
gotta have your classic.
Yeah. This is my tasting code from the American Underground.
Ah. No, the green one reminds me of, do you ever, you probably never did. I think I only had one class where we ever used them. You would have pre-sealed, like what you had to do is bring in pre-sealed answer books or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was like, it was just a blank thing, but then you had to open it like there and then you could write in it and hand it in. But it was for a test, so yeah. Yep. All right. I think I've heard a lot of good conversation from different people. So let's try and dive into this. Let's talk about it a little bit, right? What do people identify as some of the components or different elements that we need to use or reuse even if we already have some of them in our app to accomplish what we're doing here? We can reuse the display time or time display, yeah, and buttons, yeah. No, I mean that's a great point, right? Being able to reuse something because, and we're getting that partially because of the way we've already built it. Now we may, you know, when we tackle this with our existing code, we may see some problems with that. You know, there might be things where we're like, okay, we can reuse it, but we need to add something extra in. We need to tweak it in some way. But that's what happens, right? as you start reusing things, you start to say, oh, I needed extra property to allow it to change a little bit, but it's much nicer that I get to reuse the rest of that. Yeah, I think both of those are great examples. So what are some new components that we need to create or add to get this built out? A list. Yeah. Yep. And then the times or whatever that we're going to put in the list.
Yeah, it was a way to collect them, probably something that just handles collecting them, whatever. Pause. Or
Some,
not pause, split.
something to handle capturing our splits.
Yeah.
Yep. And then did you find that there's any new logic that we need or new behavior or anything like that that's tricky to capture this sort of split-based logic? Like how will you compute the splits, for example? What's the plan for computing what the time is for a split?
We're gonna use the elapsed time
You're gonna use the elapsed time?
to save the time to an array.
Okay.
And then we list out and we clear out the information by the array, and the array.
Okay. Yeah. But so that's, I mean, that works for our first time. Now what happens when we want to capture our second split? How do we get the time for how long that second split was? Because our elapsed time will be the total up till now. How will we get?
We didn't talk about that.
Wait, I was confused. I thought it was supposed to like build up or no? Is it not supposed to?
Well, a split is how long it's been since you last clicked the split. So like if we watch this, if we click start, we let a couple seconds pass, we split, all right? And then, all right, now that was a 3-second split. So even though our timer, so we pause now, our timer says we're at 11 seconds, but our splits were 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and 4 seconds.
So when you hit split, it resets back to 0?
It resets your split time back to 0, but not your total time.
Just guys having a separate split time.
Oh, okay.
Do we even use the heat?
I think we're just, it'd be like almost like the timer again, but split would work.
Without.
It's kind of a dual thing, like it saves the time or triggers the save of the time, but it also would have to call it clear.
Remember that with the pause, we not only had the last time, but we were adding the pass without time.
Yeah, so. this
We don't need to
is-
add that previous one.
Yeah, we would need to clear out the time, reset it back to 0, whenever it splits it.
It's gonna go like
So it'd be
now
a bit different from our.
minus start time. And
It has
the
some
start time would be
similarities to
the
our
last time.
stop pause button, but it'd be like a little different in that it's not adding the time, it's setting 0 when the difference between
Yeah.
running and it's running. So it's almost like a duplicate of it, but it's doing another.
Right. I haven't, it's been just a little while since I've looked at the code. So let me step back over here for a minute.
Like, would we be able to use the start button?
Let's see what we have here.
Or would we need to make like a
So this is where our state is, we've got some elapsed time. Then we have, we're capturing the time when we fired something, and then we've got our total of our elapsed time that we're saving as well, right? So let me see here. Oh, that's in what happens when we have a tick, right?
Yeah. So it'd be like this, but instead when versus running is running. Oh no, that doesn't make sense. When it is running is false, we need to set its version of the last time, I guess, back to 0. So I guess we need to have a separate thing going on from the stop
There's
pause button, like it's a similar thing on the page, but like a little different.
there's a few different ways we can handle it, you know? Yeah. I think that's a good challenge. Even if so let me ask you guys, do you want to spend some time working through a little bit of this and building it out right now, or would you rather try and tackle some of this yourself now that we've sat down and thought through some of it, and then come back and discuss it it would probably be next Tuesday so that people have an actual window of time to work on it, because, you know, otherwise you have one day. So would you rather come back and discuss it then and sort of go over maybe how I would solve it? Or would you rather try and build out a solution right now for this? Vote of hands. Build out a solution now. Nobody cares. Who'd rather spend some time trying to work on it first? All right. I'm going to, so what we'll do is take some time working on it. I may even, like, one useful thing that I would suggest when you're working on this is to split it up into separate things. If you're struggling with the React part of it, like how do I build up the components and get all that rendered, you could test this whole thing out by pulling almost all of that logic out, and instead of even rendering something, just do like console logs or something very, very, very trivial, so that what you work on is how does the split logic work? Can I capture this stuff correctly? Just focusing on that part of the problem. How do I do this time thing? Because that's sort of that's a programming problem, right? That's one of those, how do I solve this programming puzzle issues, right? So it could be straight out of a, you know, programming puzzles book or something. How would I solve something like that? And then you've got the, how do I make it display correctly with React, which is, for the most part, a separate problem. And you're going to, I think, be much more successful if you try and tackle the two a little bit separately, because otherwise you're going to be dealing with issues with both at the same time. So that's what I would recommend as we look into that, right? So then if we've got that, all right, let's spend a little bit of time today then, and we may get done a little early, I don't know. Let's talk about pulling data from somewhere else instead of just rendering the data that we already have. So we're going to do something that we haven't really done in this class before, but is, you know, incredibly important when you're working on any real-world application, is how do I fetch data? You're pretty much never going to build a front-end application that just works on the front end, that doesn't have to fetch data from a server somewhere that isn't connected, right? Everything's going back and getting data somehow, some way. So how do we build something like that in React? We'll start with what is sort of the most simple way to build something like that out. Not the more complex things that you can do, because they can be a lot more complexity as well, but that's what we're going to tackle. And there's a lot of documentation on it. There's a lot of, I feel like they sort of buried theirs on how do you handle some of this in the React documentation down here in this FAQ, like AJAX and APIs, which I think is one of the most important topics when you're dealing with stuff like this. So I wish it was more in a main concept area of their documentation, because you're not going to be looking for it. But all AJAX means is you're making a request to a server, like to go get some sort of data. And we're going to use the newer like window fetch API or interface to do this, because it's a lot cleaner than trying to write out an old school AJAX request. It'll just make your life a lot easier trying to do it this way. But let me come back here. Let me see. Did I get rid of? Oh, I do still have a clock. All right. So I'm going to bring this clock back in. And I'm just going to make it, I'm going to make something separate here. This won't look the prettiest, but it should be usable. I can't remember if my clock requires extra parameters. We'll find out. Let me just throw my clock on my page, which hopefully still exists and I didn't delete. And we've got a basic clock here, right? But this is being pulled from my system, right? I'm pulling getting the date and the time off of my own system to do this. And hey, we could be a little prettier if we wanted to. So I'm going to really quickly go into my clock and just make it a little prettier than it is right now. Let's see if I can. Hey, that worked. Cool. What color was I trying to set here? Must have decided not to use that. So let me leverage some of my stuff that I've already got over here on like my my start pause button or my clear button. My stopwatch, I pulled some of this in. I believe, oh no, maybe it was in the app level. Typography, there we go. So I'm gonna pull in this typography component, make my clock a little prettier here. This is just make it look sort of the same as everything else real fast. Let me see what I used here. I used headline, which I like. And what are my other options for typography here? Do I still have this up? I think body. Maybe if I don't provide one, it's body one. All right, that's fine. Let's make that. We'll just throw some of this stuff, bring it in. Go check it out. It's a little nicer, maybe. Got something wrong now because they're just smashed up next to each other with no spacing in between. I'm going to be really lazy here. Oh, let me see here. My app. Can I do some styling on this? I don't know if this will work. There we go. Got a little space between it. That's just me trying to make it all a little bit more consistent. So with this setup now, what I want to do is show you how we would change over, and instead of getting the date time from our local system, how we're going to set our time from an API of some kind. So this would be a very, very common pattern working with React, but it's really a common pattern for any sort of front end stuff is going and making a request from somewhere. I'm actually going to get rid of some of these console logs. So first thing you want to do is figure out where you want to make your, what am I requesting, right? How am I making a request of some kind to get data? And what we've got here is the URL. So I'll post this real fast too. But this is the, oh, somebody else already did, look. This is where we go to go get our API stuff. And then I'll pull up the React documentation to help show us, but what they're gonna recommend is you usually want to fetch your data in your component did mount lifecycle. So we haven't used this for much. The only time we did use it was in our clock, I think. But this is the opportunity to make this fetch type request because you want to do it not when you're constructing it, but after your component is already existing there and you want to say, all right, now go fetch my data because I've already rendered, get what I need to render in some way. So the syntax here is a little different than probably anything you've encountered. I'm going to, again, you see me do this a lot just so you also don't feel comfortable when stuff like this happens. Pretty much copy and paste this, except where I want to fetch is the API, my API, not the one that they have. And the API I want to go fetch from is this URL, this API. So I'm going to replace in this fetch, I'm going to say, all right, what I'm fetching up is this world clock API something something, right? What that's going to do is that's going to make a request to this server for this URL, except we don't know how long that's going to take to get back to us, right? So have we talked much about asynchronous programming at all? Like what it's like to wait on something or anything like that? Okay, so this is a new concept and I can't introduce all of it or explain it in depth. This is something that you sort of have to learn through working with them. But I do have an example that I think works pretty well when you're trying to talk about how you deal with something asynchronous like this. Because pretty much most of the work that we've done has been synchronous. We're in control of it. It renders, it just goes through our code and finishes. The closest that we've had to anything asynchronous is like our set interval or set timeout, where we say, okay, after a certain period of time, take this action again. This is much different. This is, you don't know how long it's going to take. So imagine that you're at home and you are, I don't know, you're cooking, you're getting ready to make a cake or something, right? And you start working on it and you realize, oh no, we don't have eggs and I need to put some eggs into my batter to make my cake. So I've got a problem. But your roommate says, oh, that's fine. I'll run to the store. I'll go get some eggs. And, you know, I'll come back with them when I have them, right? So this is like a real world example of something that's asynchronous, where now you could just sort of stop and do nothing until they come back, right? Okay, well, I'm just going to sit here and wait. I'm not going to do anything else. Nothing else is going to happen until I get those eggs back, and now I can work more. But in reality, we don't usually do that. That would be synchronous. That would be synchronous and very slow because you may be waiting, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 minutes. It depends on how far away it is for them to go fetch you some eggs, right? And that's the same case for making a network request. You don't want to pause your whole application while this is happening because this can take, you know, in common cases, it can take hundreds of milliseconds, which to you sounds incredibly fast, but to a computer is very, very slow and a long period of time. But, you know, in worst cases, it can take seconds or longer for stuff to come back. And you don't want to be sitting there doing nothing. So instead, if you were working on making a cake and that happened, what would you do maybe? Do the other stuff.
Something else that you can do.
Exactly. And that's exactly what asynchronous programming is about. So asynchronous programming is all about saying, okay, I'm stuck on this thing until something comes back. So what I'm going to do is set that aside and say, when my roommate comes back with the eggs, I can take up that task again. Until then, I can work on all of the other things that I'm able to work on. That are not related to that. Yes. Yep. Exactly. And sometimes, and we'll see that we're going to have to make some changes to some other things in order to accommodate this asynchronous programming. But in the end, it makes stuff more robust. But what you do is you sort of set that aside and you say, okay, when my roommate comes back, then I can pick up this task again and start working on it. But until then, I'm going to keep working on other stuff. That's what these thens are on this fetch. It's the exact same thing. It's saying then, so when they come back, I can pick up this task again. And it's saying when this fetch has resolved, I've got a couple things to do. This first one is converting the response just to JSON. It's a little awkward that you have to do this with the way a fetch works when you want to work with JSON. It's just something that you have to get used to. And what we're doing here is something in this bit of code that we haven't done a ton of, but it's chaining these functions. So it's saying, okay, go and fetch something. And when that's done, do this. And when that's done, we're going to run this whole bit of code. Now we're going to change what this code is, but each one of these is just yes.
So those are line breaks, but really the dot goes at the end of the
yes
line, right? In terms of the functionality.
Yeah, really it goes here. And so I'll rewrite this in a minute to hopefully hope it'll be a little clearer because I prefer passing functions in when you're at least showing something like this as opposed to writing it out this way. So I would do something like, I'll do something like this. Convert to JSON, and we're just going to say this takes data for a response. It has to be a response, and that's what this RES is saying response, because the response from a fetch has this JSON method attached to it. Normal data doesn't. This is saying, all right, just convert whatever the response is to JSON, right? So all I've done here is create a arrow function, and what I'm going to do now is replace this with my arrow function. Say, all right, so once this is done, then on, and then I want to do something else. In that case, that's what this whole bit of logic is, and we're going to change all of this out. But this is saying, okay, now I have a result of some kind. So let's write out, let's say, we want it to set the time from our result. In fact, I'm even going to pull this out completely. I'm going to put it up here. So I'm just going to make it a method on my component. And say set time takes a result. And then we want to do something with that. So in this case, they've got some extra sort of logic here, but I'm gonna, this is where we're gonna have to change some of this, deal with some different things. There's a little bit of sort of complexity in here that's being hidden, and we won't get into all of it. Like I say, this is sort of just touching on some of this. First thing I'm gonna do is assume the best case, which is we got something back that's legit, everything's good, nothing went bad. So that's just sort of, all right, set time, because we got a good result. But even with that, right now we're doing something interesting. I'm going to go up here and clean this up a little bit, because before we've done that, we already have a date time here that we're getting locally, right? And let's say I don't want that. Because I don't have a value in there yet. I want to get that only from getting a result. I don't want to already have that date time set. I want to set it off of what comes back, right? Or, you know what, I'm just going to let it change to make life easy, actually. I'm going to just alter it. We probably won't see a change, unfortunately, and then I'll come back and clean this up. But let's say when we get our result, which is going to look like this. I'll make this a little larger. That what we want to do is set our date time off of it. Now, off the top of my head, I'm not certain if any of these are going to be parsable into some sort of date time object by JavaScript just right out of the bat. So I'm going to pull up my dev tools and just test it out to see what happens. Cool. It looks like what they give us back in this current date time property can be passed in as a parameter directly into the date object for JavaScript, and we get back a proper date object now based off of that. So that means that I can set my date time when I get back my result. So my result is this whole object here. I can set my date time off of what we get back from this current date time, right? So we're going to be doing the same sort of thing. We've got a problem with this logic because we were resetting it, but we'll figure that out. Get rid of that console log even though we're not using it. And we'll say, okay, when our result comes back, we want to set our state. What we want to set is date time is equal to new date based off result. Let me look at my data again. Dot current date time, because that's the property on my object. So this is working with the data that came back. And that's this sort of set time method, and then I'm going to bind it here. Same way that we've done everything else. So that we're bound. And now what I'm going to do is replace. So in this following then, I'm going to replace this first argument with this dot set time, because that's what we want to do when this resolves. I'm going to leave the error here for now, hoping that we don't have an error. We'll come back and talk about this error bit in a minute. But I'm leaving it down there, not cleaning much stuff up. So now what we've got here is, if we follow the flow, when our component loads, we are setting our time based off of our original date, which is a little bit of a problem. I'm going to change some of the other logic here just to support the idea of not doing that at all.
Is that time bin? Is this
No, because I actually have another argument down here. There's a second argument to this.
Oh,
It's just badly formatted right now. So here, I'm going to comment all this stuff out, and then I will do that. Boop. There we go. But now, yes. So what we're calling is, all right, when our data comes back, convert it to JSON and send that JSON into set time, which should allow us to set our time, right? Now, don't worry too much about this other bit I'm going to do some stuff here to, let's first see if anything's broken with what I changed. Oh, did you see that? So watch when I refresh real fast. Look at the time. And then did you see it jump like 6 seconds there? 10 seconds? That's saying that there's a time difference between the time I'm getting back from that server and the time that I had set locally. So my time is off, and it's resetting it off of that. But we've got some problems with the way that's working, because see, I'm resetting my time to the local one every time. So we've got some issues. I'm going to take this, I'm going to hack this. It will not be perfect. This will show up. This goes back to the state that the problem that we had before. But let's say what I want to do is I only want this. First off, I don't want to start capturing this tick action until my time has come back. So while this isn't something that you would, oops, that wasn't what I wanted. This isn't something you would always move up like this. I'm going to put the interval connection up into here to say when I set my time, then hook up my interval to start updating my time. And I'm going to change my logic here. I think this will work. We're going to find out. To this dot state dot date time plus 1,000. Remember, this is an example of what you can't rely on, because you don't know that an interval will fire every in that time period. What is it mad at me for? It's mad at me for this. I did something wrong. All right. Let's See what's blowing up here. Okay. Let me try this. That might be what's blowing up. I don't think so. All right, that should be good. Now I'm gonna move my interval out of this. Try and do this again. See if that works. Seems to be working. So now I'm gonna change this. This might be what's wrong. That might not be a valid thing to do. Oh, okay. Wait, let me see. It's complaining about this.
So, yeah.
I was just trying to add a value to it, but I may not be able to just add something to a time. I'm gonna try and see what this says about that real fast. I'm just trying something pretty rogue there. All right, let's see. All right, if I have a time. Oh, it treats it like a string. Okay. And just add some time to it. Set. Huh. All right, let me see if I can find a way to do this. So here's what I'm going to do, which is not the best way to manage this, but it's going to be fine.
If you added it to the new date, if you added it then, would it,
It's possible for me to do this, I think. I just,
when you do new date, you put it inside?
it's possible to do what I'm trying to do here, because I can get or set something. I don't know if so. I'm gonna see if this works real fast. Which I don't know if it's gonna work. We will see. It's gonna happen. All right. This test date, that date times. Yeah, I don't think. This is me cheating. Look, they're doing the same thing. It should work. I'm gonna try to switch to seconds. I'm gonna add 1 second to it. It should. Oh, it's changing. Is it changing my current one? Is that? That's what's wrong. Let me see. Oh, it should return it. All right. So that should still be right. Is that state? Looking at my. Okay, that should be bound. There's an interval ID. Should all be fine. Should get set up in here. All right. Why are you yelling at me? Welcome to live coding. I don't know why it's yelling at me. So every tick I should be able to change my state. As a result of this having been moved up here. Shouldn't be. And I've got an initial date, which should be fine. I think it's only having an error after it gets back the data though too. So I think that is indicating, because I think we see it render and then crash. So that's after it does the fetch. All right, live troubleshooting. I'll just spend a little more time and then I'm gonna give up on this. Maybe it's not returning what it says it's returning. Let me try this. Yeah, it's not giving me back what I thought it was. Give me back just the seconds. Not a time object. Okay. Let's do that. We're going to change the way this is stored. Fine. You got it. Because I should be able to convert that. Added some seconds, not minutes. That's weird. All right, let me try something here. So I'm going to change the way this works a little bit. Make my life easier, I think. Syntax might be a little weird, but instead of storing a time object, I'm just going to store the seconds. In my, what am I calling it? Time and seconds. And then I'm going to assume that that's what I have here, and I need to create a new date out of it every time. And then it should work, convert that guy to val string. Do the same thing here, except I want to get my, let's see if this works. Invalid date on invalid date. Yeah, it's not blowing up. Right? All right, let me try it one more time real fast. Oh, it's correct, and then it comes back. Oh. Time in seconds. I think something's going wrong. Oh, wait. That's what's wrong. Gonna work now? Yes, but we're never changing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. All right. We're gonna be struggling with this. We're gonna go back to what we had. I'm gonna struggle with it a little more, but not right here. There you guys get to see the real struggles of trying to work with something even live. With experience with working with this stuff. So now instead, I'm going to do it in a very different way that's very inefficient, but it's going to be quite the hack here. So what I'm going to do is when our component mounts, I'm going to change this code up a little bit, move this interval down into here, and now, what's that?
At least not an error, but it is 1969.
Yeah. I'm going to do this fetch every time, every second, which will probably get me throttled at some point. It'll get me kicked off of the API because that's what happens with APIs. And then I don't need this logic. And set time should be correct. So let's see what happens here. Let's cross my fingers.
It's set you back to 0, right? Because this API doesn't have seconds.
Oh, it doesn't? Ah. So what you're saying is I'll only see a minute tick by every time?
Maybe it's in there, but I'm not seeing it.
Maybe I'm using the wrong value out of what comes back. Let me hit this a few times. Current file time might work. I'm going to try that real fast. I don't know. Date.
Can you give me time? Is that a thing? I don't know.
No, everything's a date object.
Oh, okay. So they don't
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably their attempt to prevent you from hitting it too frequently. So then what you'd probably only see is every minute or so, it would update itself. Yep, 8:02 now.
How did you get it to show the actual time?
You mean here?
Yeah.
That you can convert. So if you have a full date time object, that's just a toLocale_date string method on it.
You use it in this state, but what did you do to?
So yeah, you're right. It's not giving me back seconds, so we'll only see it tick off every minute, right? And we could probably find, that goes to show you how much time I should have spent looking into this API stuff. But
What did you do?
obviously I didn't. And so we've got one that is only updated on the minute for
If
the,
you took the seconds off of your clock, then you got it for clock accurate.
yeah, I do, yes.
Yeah.
That is correct.
How'd you get it to them? Well, that's what I think is weird. Especially like
Yeah.
a universal time or something that.
I mean, yeah, we'll admit that there's been some struggles with this. But let's step back from getting into the details of that and talk about the key parts here. Yes.
Okay, so when you were having the error of the local time, I put the PPG there, but that gave me the error of 1969. So what did you do instead? Stop the whole local time, not a function.
Oh, well, that's why I didn't. I instead moved I'm just pulling the date off of the API every time instead of ever updating it. So I wasn't changing it myself anymore, like trying to keep it in sync or set something.
Oh, I see.
I mean, something like this should work. So there's something a little bit off. Here. Because I get that I'm getting back a value here that's strange, but I should be able to get like an actual new date or something off of this, I thought, but it's not quite working. Oh, there we go. Okay. I got it. I just needed to wrap it with a new date. It took that number and returned that. So what's happening now is we hit the API once, and we can see that if we go look at our network request stack here, if I refresh this page, here's all of our stuff that we load, blah, 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 gibberish, gibberish, and our request to the world clock API. It tells us status code 200, this was okay, everything was fine, and here's the data you got back. So that's I mean, we'll dig into it more, we'll talk about this more, but that's the very, very basics of working with an API is you'll use fetch or something like it. This is newer and much cleaner and nicer than the old XML HTTP request. Let me just show you that so that people can be scared and try and only use fetch. This is the type of way that you would have to, oh, let me see if I can even get a good example here. Oh, no, no, no. All of that is far too clean. Like they've already abstracted out some of the ugly bits. It's too much. Yeah. Even here though, you can still see it's a little bit uglier. Like have to create this XML HTTP request. I have to add some sort of event listener thing. I have to tell it to open. It's a GET request. Here's the thing I'm opening that request to. Then I have to tell it to actually send the request. Definitely, even in that, a fair bit more going on. Whereas in this, it's like fetch this and then do something with it. Now, if you want to dig into this then concept more, this is actually what's known as a promise in JavaScript. So this is a specific type of object. It's built into the language. You can go look up promises and read all about them and be thoroughly confused and cry for a little while, as I had to write some promise code just last week, and I had to spend, and these are experienced developers, another 30 minutes walking through how it worked with the other developers, because they looked at it and they went, I can't understand this at all. This is weird voodoo magic stuff going on in this promise thing. And it was like, it takes a little while to get used to how that stuff works. But the idea is, then is the key part of a promise. So you can say then, when this something happens with this promise, invoke this function with the result. And you can just keep chaining those because it keeps returning them. Now you notice the thing we're missing here is with that 200 OK, everything's good, we're dealing with it. But we are missing something that handles an error. We don't have, so going back to our baking problem, right? We may have a real problem if what happens is we send our roommate to the store to go get eggs and they come back and they go, no eggs, they're out of eggs, right? That's an error. That means you got to do something entirely different. I can't just go and display something nice here. I have to handle that. So that's what I commented out here. There's a couple different ways to handle that with promises. They say it's important to handle errors here instead of a catch block so that we don't swallow exceptions from actual bugs and components. Don't worry too much about the difference between those two things, but we'll... Oh.
I don't get it. It's the same. Why did I have? I still have the same error here before. I can't.
You may have missed this new date wrapper I put around down here.
I know that I have that.
We'll look at it in a minute. So we can deal with an error too, though. And that's what this is trying to deal with, is what happens when an error happens, right? So this is where the other part of dealing with asynchronous type requests. So I'm going to change up our API just a little. I'm going to say loading true initially. And instead of having an actual date time here, I'm going to say null. Like, we don't have something yet because we need to get it back from the server. And now when we set our time, we'll not only set this, but we'll also set loading to false. Saying, all right, we have a value now, right? And now what we're going to do is down here in our render, we can't just immediately try and pull something off of here. So instead, I'm going to put essentially a little exception bit here. It'll say if this.state.loading, and so that'll, if this is true, this bit will run. I'm going to be very basic here. I'm just going to return string like loading. We could make this as complex as we want, right? This is any element that you want to render for React. Now our component should behave very differently. You can see just how fast we're loading, so you don't really get to see it very long. So let me try and slow that down some using some of these dev tools that'll make life easy when you're trying to debug stuff. Is I'm going to go up into here, go to my network, and now I get to tell it, oh, it's over here, sort of hard to get to. Let me see if I can make this regular size. I might be able to fit a little more on. I'm going to tell it I have a Are those the only ones available to me by default? Normally there's more than two. Reset. Yeah. I'm going to add a custom profile. Slow. I can download like 10 kilobits per second. Upload 10 kilobits per second, and I have a latency of like, there's a long latency here. What? That would be really bad, yes. And we'll refresh this, and what we should see, I don't even know if it'll actually be fast enough. It's like, I can't even pull down your bundle, your code. So even the local stuff is actually slowed down by that, unfortunately. So I'm gonna try slow 3G. I'll see if this works instead. Yeah, slow 3G is acceptably slow enough. We'll probably still see the loading. So now we see our loading for a while until we get back the result from our API request. So that's starting to get into what do you do with this asynchronous thing, right? That's how do I set my component up so that it can handle it when it hasn't gotten data yet or it's waiting on it. And then the next step for something like this is what do I do when an error happens? And so they've got their note here. I'll just nix this. But we need to write something to handle an error as well. So let's say I'm going to do it much like I did here. Set error. We'll get back whatever the error is, and this dot set state. We're going to set loading to false because we've loaded. And we're going to set error. I'm actually not going to set it the way that it has. I'm just going to set like some string here. Something went wrong. You could actually get an error object instead, but there's not much of a difference. This dot set error was this dot set error dot bind to this. And your error is your second optional argument to a then function, so it can take two arguments. The first is what happens in a good case, and the second one is what happens when an error happens. So now I'm going to do this set error bit. I don't know how to force an error here. Let me see if I can. Actually, I can. So what I'm going to do here is in the result of this first then, instead of actually returning this, I'm going to throw an error. And then we should, I'll leave it on a slow 3G. We should be able to see the results of an error here, except we won't really get to see something because we haven't written any code to output that error yet, right? So we've got loading, and then we're not handling it, right? That was really weird because there was a bus, and yet it sounded like a train because of the motorcycles behind it. I don't know about you guys. But what we can do, right, is something very similar to what we did here, right? So we could add in another little block here, conditional thing that says like if this dot state dot error, we're going to render our error, right? Return this dot state dot error or something. In reality, you'd do something a lot more complex than this. You're not going to throw something just really simple up there. But let me speed it up a little bit. Fast 3G, throttling. Oh. Didn't render the way I wanted. Did I set my error? Error, something went wrong. Set error, throw an error. This may not actually be, it's interesting. No, because it's definitely, that might be getting caught in this set time instead, which is weird. That's throwing me for a loop. I actually don't know the answer to this either. I'm going to set some breakpoints and try and see what's happening in the code. It's not actually, so it's got an error, but apparently the way the promise works, that error isn't causing it to go down the error path of my later than. I don't know. I can fix that at a later time, but oh, I know what's wrong. No, this should return this error. I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. No clue. We'll deal with it at another time. So it's not going actually down this error path. I mean, we could test that by doing something like saying when you resolve, we could try to set the error instead. So when it resolves in a positive fashion. Let's just make sure, you know, like, hey, our error code renders, it works, it does something. But yeah, apparently throwing an error there didn't actually cascade down the way I expected it to. One day, a lot of nice mistakes up here from me. And I'm sure that as a result of that, people got lost while we were working with APIs. But this is the very basic gist, right? You're doing something like this to work with an API. You're doing something that says, I need to handle something now, and then I need to handle it when the data comes back and do something else with that. Now, in most cases, like I chose one that was very, very simple that we can just make a call to. In most cases, you have to do a little bit more work for an API. So usually, for example, if we looked up other examples, you would see that you can't just do like a direct fetch the way that we did right there. You have to add in some extra parameters because you're required to give it like a key. So if we searched up, I don't know, a good example would be like probably a Google Maps API or something. If we went and looked at how this stuff works, like one of the first things that it would have you do, and it's going to be even harder than I thought. But one of the first things it would have you do is get a developer key set up. And that key is unique to you when you're making requests. It's like your identification token to say like this, my app is making these requests. And usually that's so that they can do things like say, oh, well, you're allowed 1,000 requests a month before we start charging you, or 1,000 free ones. And if you haven't paid for a paid tier, then we're going to stop allowing your requests to get anything. You know, or it might be, you know, we just want to identify the unique people hitting us. There's a lot of reasons to have those keys associated with, but usually it's so that they've got your identity. It's your piece of identifying information to say, like, this is this application, this is me making the request, you know, bill it to me, whatever. So all of that, though, is just sort of built on top of this very basic concept of being able to make a network request, get some data back, render it into your app. Other than me sort of getting lost a little bit as we went through that, any big questions on working with APIs at the basic level? Yeah.
So you put the fetch inside component did mount.
Yes.
Should we always have component did mount? In general, when we're building the React?
No, usually you don't need component did mount. You know, for most of your components, you don't need it.
You might put that fetch side somewhere else. I mean, if they were getting something static, we just needed a bunch of
Right.
once out of an API, and then we're just going to interact with it just on our own and not do anything.
Right. So there's a lot of different ways you can handle something like that. That gets into the whole deep area of state management and how to make this types of things, right? So I can talk about from a straight React level, like maybe you're fetching data from one API and you're using it through all of your different components, and you only need to fetch it once, right? You might put that in the component. If you don't want to pull in another library, or you don't want to set it outside somewhere, you might put it in a component did mount in the root app for your application, right? The root component, and then it'll pass that information down through everywhere, right? Or another way that you could do it very, very simply, you know, without having to pull in too much more, is because fetch gives you back a promise. So let's say we don't want to make this fetch call like directly in here because we sort of don't want it wrapped in a component. One thing you could do that's not too hard is we could create another file. Let's say, I don't know what we'll call it, right? Well, it should be like a get time, right? Or something like that. So I'm going to make this a JavaScript file real fast. And then what you could have it being, since it's a module, is you could say like, oh, when my application loads up, I don't want to have to wait for stuff to render or anything like that. I want to be able to fetch that data right away. And this gets into a little bit of complexity about how promises work. But you could do something like, say, let time result equals, and then let's step over here to our clock. We're going to hijack this fetch. I'm going to hijack everything up to here, actually, to make life easier. I'm going to change this for a minute. So here I've got this convert to JSON, and now let time result equals the result of fetching this and then converting to JSON. And so the interesting thing about how promises work is you can chain them. So this fetch returns a promise, but the .then off of it will also return a promise. So what's stored right now in time result is a promise. So you could easily in here write time result .then and say do something with the result here. And this is getting into something that's a little controversial. Some people don't like to do stuff like this, but you could also say exports time result. What you're exporting is this promise. And if you wanted it to be like the default, you could say export default time result. And now you could import that into your components and just .then off of it. And whenever it's been resolved, you'll be able to work with that data. And multiple things can do a .then, and you can even .then a promise that's already resolved before. You'll just get the results of it having resolved. So every component could essentially hook itself up directly to it and say like, oh, when this is resolved, give me the data. And they all act almost like they don't know that the other ones are hooked up to that same bit of data. So that's a little weird, a little controversial, but that's a very minimal way to do it, right? These are the ways that you could do it without introducing other libraries. And then you get into there are whole libraries around state management, and instead of holding it in a component here or even a high-level component somewhere up above, you might have a separate state management system where it makes the calls and it holds onto that information. And then you can bind your components to that to say, ooh, when this state changes, notify me. This is the state I care about. Update me in some way. And we'll talk more about that because of how much of an ecosystem there is around that. There's several. That's another thing, like, you know, I showed the CSS and JS stuff and how there was tons of those. There's dozens of state management options. But I would say that the reason I haven't got into those is I found that they were pretty complex last time we talked about them in one of the classes. It introduced a lot of complexity early on. I think it's a lot nicer to work with just the set state and local state for your components first, and then talk about what later, after people feel a little more comfortable with working with set state, talk about why there's value in pulling that out into a state management library. But we haven't been dealing with anything that really reached the level of complexity that needed a state management library. That's a good question, though. Any other questions? Al? All right, then. So Thursday, my plan is to talk about higher order components, a little bit about that. Again, this isn't a like specific like part of the React spec, but it's just a really cool way to build stuff out and reuse functionality between components. And you'll encounter them a lot inside of React code. And then I'll post something about it, but yeah, I encourage you to work on adding the lap timer or the split timer into your application. And then next Tuesday, we'll probably go over a solution to that as well. All right.